My name is Brooke Bennett. I am 34 years old, a contracts analyst living in Portland, Oregon. Most days, my job is quiet. I read fine print, catch the tricks other people miss, and make sure the right person keeps the power. I never thought those skills would end up saving me from my own parents. But the day came when the words I heard across the kitchen table cut deeper than any contract dispute at work. It happened on a Monday morning that already felt sour. The smell of burned coffee lingered in the air while my mother Diane's heels clicked sharply against the tile. She moved with the urgency of someone who wanted an audience. My father Earl sat at the head of the table with a stack of bills clutched in his hand. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set, and then he threw the words at me like stones. "Pay rent or get out. This is my house." The sound of it echoed against the cabinets. My mother smirked like she had won a small war. Together they laughed, as if the line they drew was final, and I was just a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I sat still. My fork rested on the plate, untouched. Their laughter was sharp and cold. But instead of breaking me, it struck something steady inside. I felt the calm rise up the way it does when you realize you have already thought 3 steps ahead. I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition that the game had just revealed itself. What they did not see was the way I looked at the window behind them. To them, I appeared small and cornered. Inside, I was already mapping an exit they could not imagine. Every insult they tossed across that table only pushed me closer to action. I stood without raising my voice. My chair scraped softly against the tile, a sound much quieter than their mockery. My father waved me off like a tenant who could not pay. My mother muttered something about senior housing as if I had no place beyond their walls. I left the room with their laughter chasing me down the hall. That was the last time they believed they held the upper hand. Because 3 days later, in a quiet office that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh ink, I signed the paperwork that changed everything. The broker slid the folder across the table, her voice steady as she pointed to the line where my name belonged. The number was bold, black, and undeniable. $900,000. I picked up the pen, and my hand did not shake. I thought of my mother's smirk, my father's finger stabbing the air, and the words they had thrown at me. They believed their threats would corner me. They never realized the ground they stood on was not theirs to claim. When the pen touched paper, I felt the weight of years shift. The stroke of my signature was clean, deliberate, final. By the time I set the pen down, the house they used to remind me was theirs had already begun to slip away. That afternoon, I walked out of the office and into the sunlight. The air felt different, lighter, like the moment before a storm clears. I imagined the driveway back home, the place where their laughter had rung so loud, and I knew that soon the echo would change. What had started as a joke at my expense would end with their faces drained of certainty. They told me to pay or get out. I chose a third option. I took control in silence. And when the truth reached them, it would not come in the form of another argument or raised voice. It would come in black ink and binding law. They thought I was powerless. They thought they had locked me into a corner with no doors. What they never understood was that I had the keys all along, and this is the story of how their laughter turned into tears because they believed they owned me. But I was the one who held the final say. The sound of my parents' laughter that morning did not just sting. It awakened something old inside me, like a door creaking open to a hallway of memories I had spent years trying to seal shut. Every cruel word they threw in my face carried the weight of an entire childhood, spent proving myself while being treated as little more than a convenient resource. Growing up, I was the child who never complained, the one who handled things quietly while my brother Brady stumbled his way through life. He was celebrated for small efforts, while I was told that excellence was expected. When he scraped by with a passing grade, my parents praised him as if he had conquered the world. When I brought home top marks, the reaction was muted, followed by a reminder that being smart means you can take care of more than just yourself. They made intelligence sound less like a gift and more like a debt I could never finish paying. By 16, I was already carrying responsibilities that didn't belong to me. Brady needed help just to graduate high school. I spent evenings hunched over his homework while he joked with friends on the phone. My mother would glance in, smile proudly, and say, see, Brooke always rescues her brother. Those words etched themselves into me. Rescue became my role, not daughter, not equal, but rescuer. That same year, my father drove me to the bank. Brady wanted a car, but with no credit history, he had no chance of approval. My father leaned close and whispered, "You're careful, Brooke. You read the details. Sign here and everything will be fine." I remember the weight of the pen in my hand and the guilt pressing harder than his words. Saying no felt impossible. I signed, and the loan was mine as much as Brady's. When he missed payments, I watched my credit bleed while he kept driving. College should have been my escape, but instead it became another way to carry the family's burdens. I earned scholarships, worked nights, and still my paychecks vanished into the same familiar vacuum. My parents called it fairness. "You have free tuition. Brady doesn't. Help even it out," my mother insisted. So I sent money home semester after semester, while Brady treated his classes like a playground. I survived on instant noodles and secondhand books while funding his nights out. After graduation, I thought finally I could breathe. I landed a steady job, built a small safety net, and for the first time felt like I was standing on my own. But independence did not change their expectations. My parents called whenever bills stacked up. Brady rang whenever he lost another job. "You're the one with a head for numbers," my father reminded me. "Family looks out for each other." The truth was, family meant Brooke looks out for everyone, while no one looked out for Brooke. I told myself sacrifice meant love. I told myself giving was proof of loyalty. But the truth is, every check I wrote became another stone in the wall they built between us. Gratitude never came. Only the assumption that I would say yes again. The more I gave, the less they saw me as a daughter. I became a safety net, a walking account balance, an automatic solution. Looking back, the pattern is so clear. At the time, I convinced myself it was temporary, that one day they would see me as more than the responsible one, more than the girl with the pen in her hand. But entitlement grows. What starts as a request becomes a demand. What begins with guilt hardens into expectation. So when my parents mocked me in that kitchen, their words did not come from nowhere. They were the latest chapter in a book written long ago. I had paid for cars I never drove, classes I never took, repairs I never benefited from. I had been called dependable, but what they meant was disposable. That Monday morning was not the beginning of betrayal. It was the breaking point. The morning after their threats, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The light through the window was soft, but nothing about the room felt gentle. My mother Diane moved with sharp efficiency, opening and closing cabinets like each slam was punctuation. My father Earl shuffled papers in his hands until he had them stacked like ammunition. When he finally dropped them on the table, the sound cracked through the silence. "These bills keep piling up," he said, his voice heavy with accusation. "And you sit here every day like this place is a hotel." My mother added quickly, "It's not fair, Brooke. You're grown. We cover the taxes, the insurance, the repairs. You don't act like a guest, but you sure don't act like the owner either." She stood with her arms folded, her eyes narrowed as if she were surveying a stranger, not her daughter. I looked down at the numbers scrawled across the statements. Water, power, property tax. I had seen it all before. What I wanted to say was that I had already covered more than they realized. What I wanted to remind them was how many times I had saved this house when they were too careless to notice the edge. Instead, I sat quietly, taking in their words as if silence could protect me from their barbs. My father leaned closer, his voice dropping into something cold. "You're old enough to pay your share. If you don't want to, then maybe you should find somewhere else to live." Before I could answer, the front door opened without a knock. Heavy footsteps announced my brother Brady, as if the house belonged to him more than it ever did to me. He strode into the kitchen, his jacket half zipped, the smell of last night's beer clinging to him. His wife Melissa trailed behind, her eyes lowered, her purse clutched like a shield. "Perfect timing," Brady said, clapping his hands once as if to summon attention. "We need to talk." My mother immediately softened, her expression changing from sharp to concerned. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked. Brady sat down across from me, spreading his elbows wide on the table like he intended to take up all the space. "Work's been rough. Contracts fell through. I just need a little help this month. $5,000 will cover it. After that, things will settle. You know I'll pay you back." His words landed like a script I had already memorized. Different month, same request. The exact amount might change, but the plea was always identical. His eyes flicked toward me, not with shame, but with expectation. He had grown used to my support, to my money filling the gaps in his reckless choices. I took a slow breath. "No, Brady," I said, my tone calm but unyielding. His eyes widened before narrowing into anger. "No? What do you mean? No, you always help. That's what family does." "Family doesn't mean draining the same person over and over," I replied. "You've had enough help. You need to figure this out on your own." He leaned back, his laugh short and bitter. "Unbelievable. You sit here, living under their roof, contributing nothing. And you call me irresponsible? You're the one who takes and never gives? You're uncaring, Brooke. Always have been." The word uncaring cut deep, not because it was true, but because it was the opposite of everything I had ever been. Years of sacrifice erased in one careless accusation. My parents said nothing. They let his words hang in the air, their silence speaking louder than any defense. Melissa shifted in her chair, her eyes darting toward me with something like apology. But she didn't speak either. She rarely did. Brady filled the room with noise, and the rest of them let it pass as truth. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. My voice was steady when I spoke. "I'm not your bank, Brady. I'm not your scapegoat either. If you can't manage your life, that's on you." He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the stack of bills my father had left there. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "When everything falls apart, don't come crawling to me." I looked at him, then at my parents, and saw the same pattern I had known my whole life. Accusations aimed at me, excuses made for him. It was the same story, just told louder now. I walked away from the table without raising my voice, without giving them the fight they wanted. Inside, I felt the pressure tightening, the walls closing in, but alongside the suffocation was something new. Determination. Every insult, every demand, every false accusation was pushing me closer to the moment they would finally understand who I really was. When the noise of the morning finally settled and the echo of Brady's fist on the table stopped rattling through me, I retreated to my room. The door clicked shut, and silence wrapped around me like a blanket I had been starving for. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint light spilling across the carpet, and let the weight of their accusations settle into my chest. They had called me uncaring, a burden inside the very house I had saved. The irony pressed harder than their words. I reached for the top drawer of my desk. My hands did not tremble, though my breath slowed as if preparing for confession. Inside lay a plain white envelope, worn at the edges from being handled too many times, but still sealed with the gravity of what it contained. I pulled it out carefully and placed it on my lap, tracing the corner with my finger before sliding it open. Inside was the operating agreement of June Maple LLC, a company name that meant nothing to my parents, but everything to me. Across the crisp pages in bold ink sat my name. I was the managing member, the one with full authority. On paper, the house belonged to the LLC. In practice, it meant I had been holding the true ownership all along. 3 summers earlier, the county had posted a notice of intent to seize the property for unpaid taxes. My parents had ignored the warnings until it was almost too late. I remember standing on this very floor, holding that notice in my hand, realizing that the roof over our heads could be gone within weeks. My parents argued in the kitchen, each blaming the other, neither taking responsibility. I stepped in because I could not bear to see everything collapse. I gathered my savings, paid the debt, and formed June Maple LLC to protect the property from another reckless mistake. They signed the papers without reading them, eager to make the problem disappear. They thanked me once, briefly, then carried on as though nothing had changed, but everything had. From that day forward, I was not just their daughter. I was the silent keeper of their future, the guardian of the home they claimed as their own. I lifted the agreement closer, reading the lines I had memorized long ago. Each clause was a shield. Each paragraph was proof that I had acted not out of greed, but out of necessity. My parents believed their threats had cornered me, but they had been living on ground I quietly controlled. On the dresser sat a framed photograph of my grandmother June, the woman whose name I had chosen for the company. She had passed before I was old enough to fully appreciate her strength, but the stories I remembered painted her as a woman of principle. She believed in kindness, but she also believed in boundaries. I spoke softly to her picture, my voice steady but low. Being kind doesn't mean letting others take what's mine. You taught me that without even knowing it. Her smile in the photo seemed timeless, untouched by the bitterness that had taken root in the generation after her. I placed the envelope beside her frame, the two symbols side by side, heritage and hard evidence. I whispered again, this time more to myself than to her. I saved this house from being taken, but in doing so, I became the one who decides its fate. I'm the keeper of their destiny now, whether they acknowledge it or not. The words hung in the quiet room like a vow. For years, I had been treated as an endless supply, an open account, a safety net. But the truth sat in my drawer all along. They mocked me, they belittled me, they called me a burden. Yet the only reason they still had walls around them was because I had carried the burden they refused to bear. Holding the envelope, I felt no thrill of power, only the sharp clarity of responsibility. This paper was not revenge by itself. It was protection, a shield waiting to be lifted at the right moment. And deep inside, I knew that moment was drawing closer. The white envelope lay safely back in my drawer, but its weight followed me everywhere. That evening, as my parents laughed in the living room at a game show and Brady shouted into his phone about another failed deal, I slipped into my car and drove across town. The hum of the engine was steady, but inside, I felt the sharp rhythm of resolve building. It was no longer enough to know the truth. It was time to act on it. I parked outside a small office tucked between a bakery and a law firm. The sign above the door read, Price Realty Group. I had found her name through a colleague at work who had whispered that if I wanted discretion and results, Janelle Price was the one. I needed someone who could move quickly without stirring rumors through the neighborhood. Inside, the office smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon polish. Janelle stood as I entered, extending a firm hand. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed with an air of confidence that came from closing deals others thought impossible. "You must be Brooke," she said, her tone professional but warm. I nodded, lowering my voice. "I need help with a property, and I need it handled quietly." She gestured for me to sit. "Confidentiality is my specialty. Tell me what you're looking to do." I pulled a folded copy of the LLC paperwork from my bag, not the original, but enough to prove authority. She scanned it quickly, her eyebrows lifting. "So you're the managing member. That gives you control." "Yes," I said. "The house is in Springfield." Maplewood Lane recognition flickered across her face. "That neighborhood is in high demand right now. Families are desperate for properties near the schools. If you want a list, we'll have offers almost immediately." She leaned forward slightly. "Brooke, you could easily sell for $900,000, maybe even more if the bidding gets aggressive." The number hung in the air like a spark. $900,000. It was validation that the years I had poured into protecting that house had value beyond the ridicule I endured. My parents believed I had no power, that I was a burden at their table. They had no idea the ground under their feet was worth close to $1 million, and I alone held the authority to decide its fate. I looked at Janelle carefully. "How soon could we start?" Her smile was quick, decisive. Photos tomorrow, listing within 48 hours. And if we're lucky, you'll have multiple offers by the end of the week. This market is not waiting around. I breathed in slowly. The words felt like air filling lungs that had been collapsed for too long. Then that's what we'll do. 3 days from now, I'll sign. She slid a preliminary contract across the desk, her pen clicking softly. I'll need your signature here to get started. I studied the line, the empty space where my name would soon rest. My parents' voices echoed faintly in memory, the command to pay rent or leave, the smirk that accompanied it. I thought of Brady calling me uncaring while he asked for another bailout. I thought of the silence in my room as I held that envelope against the photo of my grandmother. And then I placed the pen down, calm and deliberate, leaving my mark where it could no longer be ignored. Janelle gathered the papers with practiced efficiency. You'll hear from me within a day. Brooke, you're about to take control of your life in a way they'll never see coming. Walking back to my car, the air felt sharper, the night clearer. The decision was no longer an idea hidden in my drawer. It was in motion, carried forward by ink and intent. For the first time in years, I was not just reacting to their demands. I was making the move that would redefine everything. When I returned from Janelle's office, I knew every move had to be precise. The plan was already in motion, yet inside the house, everything looked unchanged. My parents carried on as if their ultimatum had been the last word. That illusion worked in my favor. The quieter I stayed, the stronger my position became. I started with the boxes. They were small, no larger than what could be mistaken for seasonal storage. Late at night, when the house finally fell into uneasy silence, I pulled them from the closet and filled them with pieces of my life that no one else cared to notice. Old textbooks, photo albums, a few keepsakes from college. I wrapped each item carefully, not because they were fragile, but because they were mine, objects that reminded me of years when my worth wasn't measured in how much I could pay for someone else's mistakes. I stacked the boxes neatly in the corner of my room, hidden behind hanging clothes and a folded blanket. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had changed. That was the point. I needed them blind until it was too late to stop me. The next morning, my mother's voice rang sharp before I had even reached the kitchen. Brooke, the electricity bill doubled again. You think this house runs on magic? She slapped the envelope onto the counter the way she always did, a gesture that was more about humiliation than communication. My father added his own chorus. You sit in that room with your papers, and you act like you don't use anything. But you live here, don't you? This is our roof, our name on the line. I nodded calmly, pretending to absorb their grievances while inside I counted the days. 3. That was all it would take before the listing went live. Their accusations no longer pierced the way they once had. They became background noise, like the ticking of a clock waiting for the hour to strike. Brady's arrival that evening turned the atmosphere heavier still. He barged through the front door, his voice already raised, demanding another bailout. $5,000 isn't a lot, Brooke. You make good money. Why not help family? His tone dripped with entitlement, as if generosity was not a choice, but a requirement carved into my birthright. I stood firm. I've already told you no. He sneered, the same look he used when we were kids, and he wanted to cover failure with bravado. You've got savings. You just don't want to share. That's what makes you so cold. Melissa, his wife, hovered near the door. She didn't speak, but her eyes flicked toward me with something like shame, as though she saw the truth, but lacked the courage to say it aloud. I held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at Brady. Your problems aren't mine to solve. He stormed out with curses trailing behind him, leaving the door half open and the night air sweeping into the hallway. My mother shut it quickly, muttering about how family was supposed to stick together. My father shook his head, disappointment etched into every line on his face, but neither of them confronted Brady. They saved their sharpest words for me. In my room, I added another box to the corner. This one held letters from my grandmother June, her handwriting looping across yellowed paper. I read one before sealing the lid. "Kindness doesn't mean letting people walk through you, Brooke," she had written. The words steadied me more than any argument could. The house felt like a storm building with no release, tension layered on tension. Every conversation ended in accusation. Every glance carried suspicion. I moved through it silently, letting them believe I was the same compliant daughter who always absorbed the blows. They never noticed the quiet shift in my posture, the small signs of preparation. Outside, autumn winds rattled the windows, and leaves scraped across the driveway. Inside, I folded the last box closed and whispered to myself, "Not much longer." The calm I carried was not surrender. It was the stillness before thunder breaks. The morning of the walkthrough carried a sharp edge in the air, the kind that makes every sound seem louder than it should. I had arranged it with Janelle 2 days earlier, careful to choose a time when my parents would be home. I wanted no more illusions. The truth would have to stand in front of them in flesh and ink. At exactly 10, a car pulled into the driveway. Through the front window, I saw them, a young couple stepping out with 2 children in tow, the boy clutching a toy truck, the girl holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. Their faces held that mix of nerves and hope I'd seen so many times during property transactions. They were not just buyers, they were a family searching for a place to grow. The doorbell rang, clear and polite. I moved to open it. But before I could reach the handle, my mother Diane swept into the hall. "Who's at the door?" she demanded, suspicion already darkening her tone. When the family appeared in the doorway behind me, her voice rose into a shriek. "What on earth is this? Who let strangers into my home?" Her words echoed like gunfire. The little girl clutched her rabbit tighter. The young couple exchanged uncertain glances. I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady. "They're here for a scheduled walkthrough." My father Earl joined her, his face red. "Walkthrough? This isn't some open house. This is our property. Who gave permission?" The children shrank back, sensing the storm. The young wife tried to speak, but faltered under Diane's glare. My mother's fingers stabbed the air toward them. "Get out before I call the police. This is my house." I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I crossed to the dining table where the white envelope rested. I set it down gently, as though it carried no weight, though inside I felt the ground shift beneath us all. I opened the flap and slid the papers halfway into view. "Actually," I said, my tone calm enough to slice through the chaos, "no, it isn't." The room froze. My parents stared at me, their outrage momentarily stunned into silence. My father blinked as if he had misheard. My mother's lips parted. But no sound came out. The young husband cleared his throat softly, as though searching for a way to retreat, without making things worse. We were told today was confirmed for a showing." Janelle stepped forward then, her heels clicking on the hardwood as she entered behind them. She carried her folder with the same quiet authority she had shown me in her office. "It was confirmed," she said firmly, "by Brooke. She is the authorized party for this property." My mother snapped her head toward her. "That's impossible. She doesn't own anything. This is our home." I tapped the envelope lightly with my fingertips. 3 summers ago, when the county nearly seized this place for unpaid taxes, I paid the debt. I set up June Maple, LLC, and placed the deed inside it. I became the managing member. On paper and in law, this house is mine to sell. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. My father's jaw slackened, his eyes darting to the envelope, as though the ink inside it might burn him. My mother staggered back a step, clutching the edge of a chair as if the furniture could hold her up. The young family shifted uncomfortably, caught between sympathy and the awkwardness of witnessing a fracture that could not be hidden. The children pressed close to their parents' legs, sensing the tension even if they didn't understand the words. Finally, Diane's voice returned, but it was thin, brittle. "You're lying. This is some kind of trick." Janelle spoke with practiced calm. "It's no trick. I have verified the documents myself. Brooke holds full authority. If you'd like, I can show you the filings from the county records." My father turned to me, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. You did this behind our backs? I met his gaze without flinching. I did what you refused to do. Protect this house. You nearly lost it. I saved it. And now I decide its future. The air crackled with tension. My parents' laughter, so cruel days before, was gone. In its place stood shock and dawning fear. They had thought their threats were final. They had never imagined I had already written the ending. The young family retreated politely toward the front porch with Janelle, giving us space. The door closed softly behind them, leaving only the four of us in the living room. The silence stretched, brittle and sharp. My father's eyes stayed locked on the envelope as if it might explode. My mother finally broke, her voice trembling with disbelief. What are you talking about? You don't own anything here. You're making this up. I pulled the agreement fully out of the envelope, spreading the pages across the coffee table. The black ink was crisp, the signatures unmistakable. My mother leaned forward, her mouth falling open as her eyes traced the familiar loops of her name written in her own hand. My father followed, his brow furrowing deeper with every line he recognized. You signed these in 2019, I said quietly, but with the weight of stone. The county had issued a notice of seizure. Taxes were unpaid. You didn't want the fight, so you let me fix it. I paid the debt and created June Maple LLC. You signed the transfer willingly. This house has been under my control for 4 years. For a moment, they stared at the paper in stunned silence. The truth glared up at them, undeniable and irreversible. My mother's lips trembled as she whispered, "This is fraud." You tricked us. I shook my head slowly. Number fraud requires deception. I told you then exactly what it was. You didn't listen because you were desperate to make the problem disappear. You signed. It was legal, filed, and recorded. Nothing about this is hidden. The only thing you didn't want to face was that the house was never safe in your hands. My father slammed a fist against the table, rattling the glass coasters. We thought you were helping, not stealing. I met his fury with steady calm. I was helping. Without me, the house would already belong to the county. You would have been evicted years ago. Instead, you stayed here, mocking me, calling me a burden under a roof that survived because I carried it. The words landed like stones, dropped into water. The ripples of silence spread outward. My parents looked down at the paper again, and I could see recognition dawning behind their outrage. They remembered the day in that attorney's office, the way they had scrawled their names quickly, anxious to leave. They had trusted my responsibility then. Now that same responsibility was the proof they could not erase. My mother finally slumped back into the couch, her voice faint but filled with bitterness. You set us up. You waited for this moment. I held her gaze without blinking. No, I prayed this moment would never come. I kept the envelope sealed for years, hoping you would treat me like family instead of a bank account. But every insult, every demand, every threat brought us here. This isn't a setup. It's the law. And the law doesn't care about your version of ownership. It cares about signatures and filings. The room grew heavy. So quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My father's face drained of color. My mother's hand shook as she tried to push the papers away, but they slid back toward her, immovable. For once, I didn't need to raise my voice. The documents spoke louder than anger ever could. This isn't betrayal, I said finally, my words low but cutting. This is consequence. You thought control was yours. It never was, and now you see it. The silence that followed pressed down like a storm cloud ready to break. No one moved. No one could. The house was still tense from the confrontation over the agreement when the front door slammed open without warning. It was evening, and the sun had already dropped low, painting the windows with streaks of amber. Brady stumbled inside, the smell of whiskey arriving before his words. His boots dragged across the floor, his shoulders hunched with a weight that looked less like exhaustion and more like rage, hunting for a target. "Where is she?" he barked, his voice carrying through the hallway. Melissa trailed behind him, her hands clenched around her purse straps, her eyes darting nervously as though she already knew what was about to happen. I stepped out from the living room. "I'm here, Brady. What do you want?" He lurched toward me, his face flushed, his speech just a little too loud. "I want what you owe me. 5,000. Tonight. Don't play games." Behind him, Melissa whispered, "Brady, please, not like this." He ignored her. I folded my arms, grounding myself in calm. "I don't owe you anything. I've told you that before. I'm not giving you money." His laugh was sharp, bitter. "You sit on your high horse while I drown. You've got savings, you've got control, and you think you're better than the rest of us. Don't pretend you can't help." The anger in his eyes flared, but I refused to look away. "Helping isn't the same as feeding your self-destruction. I won't be your crutch anymore." He moved closer, his steps uneven. "Selfish. Always uncaring. You live off mom and dad, then throw that paper in their face. Now you think you're powerful, huh? You think a stack of documents makes you queen of this house?" My parents hovered near the kitchen doorway, frozen, their silence as heavy as stone. Diane pressed a hand to her mouth. Earl muttered something I couldn't hear. But neither of them stepped forward. Their golden sun was unraveling. And they let the unraveling fall on me. Brady slammed a hand against the wall beside me, making the picture frames rattle. His face was inches from mine, the sour reek of alcohol mixing with fury. "Give me the money or I swear." Melissa rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "Brady, stop. You're scaring her. You're scaring me." He shook her off violently, but the momentary pull broke his stance. His fist tightened, his arm twitched, but it hovered in the air, caught between impulse and consequence. My voice cut through the tension before he could move further. "If you hit me, you won't just lose a sister. You'll lose whatever is left of yourself. I won't cover for you anymore." The words landed with a thud in the silence. His chest heaved, his face twisted with frustration. But the strike never came. Instead, he staggered back, his breathing ragged. Melissa placed both hands against his chest, forcing distance between us. Her eyes were wet, her voice cracking. "Enough, Brady. Please, enough. Look at what you're doing." He stared at me one last time, fury still burning, then spit the words like venom. "You're dead to me, Brooke. Don't come crawling when this blows up in your face." He stormed out, the door slamming so hard the glass rattled. Melissa lingered for half a beat, her eyes finding mine with something like sorrow and apology before she hurried after him. The house settled into silence again. But it wasn't peace. It was the silence after thunder, when you know the storm hasn't passed, only moved farther down the line. I stood there, steady but shaken. Every accusation, every demand, every near-violent outburst only confirmed what I had known for years. These weren't family ties anymore. They were ropes used to pull me down, and I had finally stopped letting them tighten around my throat. The echoes of Brady's rage still clung to the walls when I noticed movement outside the front window. Through the curtains, I saw Mrs. Alvarez from next door standing on her porch, a grocery bag balanced on one hip. She had paused mid-step, her head tilted toward our house, her face set in a look of concern. I knew what she had heard. The yelling, the slam of fists against walls, the final door crash that shook the glass panes. For years we had kept our chaos contained within these walls, a performance of civility for the neighborhood. But now the mask was cracking, and someone else had caught sight of the truth. When I stepped outside a few minutes later, hoping to breathe air that wasn't thick with accusation, she was still there. Her eyes softened when she saw me, though her lips pressed into a tight line. "Brooke? Mija?" she said gently. "Is everything all right?" I heard shouting. It sounded bad. Her words carried no judgment, only worry. Still, I felt the weight of exposure. Secrets I had held for years were spilling into the open, carried by voices too loud to silence. I met her gaze, my tone even. It was bad, but it's under control now. She shifted the bag higher on her hip, watching me carefully. Families fight, I know. But this sounded different. I nodded slowly, the truth pushing up against the back of my teeth. It is different. Some fights aren't about words. They're about years of taking without giving. And sometimes the only way to survive is to stop letting yourself be taken from. She studied me for a long moment, then gave a small nod of understanding. She didn't press for details, but her silence carried something powerful. Acknowledgement. She had seen enough to know the storm wasn't one-sided. As I turned back toward the door, I spoke softly, almost to myself. Sometimes the truth doesn't need me to scream. It finds its own way out. The air felt heavier, but not only with dread. There was a strange relief in knowing someone else had witnessed what had been buried inside for so long. Mrs. Alvarez's presence, quiet and steady, meant the story of this family was no longer trapped within four walls. It had slipped into daylight, undeniable. When I closed the door behind me, the house seemed smaller. My parents sat stiffly in the living room, pretending nothing had happened. But their eyes betrayed them. They knew now that the humiliation was not just ours to carry. The neighbors had heard. The neighborhood would talk. And for once, I didn't feel the urge to hide it. Exposure was its own form of justice. 2 days after the confrontation, my phone buzzed with Janelle's name across the screen. I stepped onto the porch, needing air, needing space from the walls that still carried Brady's drunken shouting. The evening was cool, the kind of quiet that made even the faintest sound sharp. I answered, keeping my voice low. "Brooke," Janelle said, her tone brisk but edged with excitement. "I've got news. We listed the house at $900, but there's already an offer above asking. $920. Cash buyer. They're eager, and they want to move fast." For a moment, I didn't breathe. The number wasn't just money, it was affirmation. Every insult, every accusation of uncaringness, every moment of being called a burden had pushed me toward this. Now here was proof that the very roof they used to shame me was worth far more than they ever imagined. "Send me the paperwork," I said evenly. "You're sure?" Janelle asked. "We could hold out for a bidding war. The market's still hot. But I have to tell you, this buyer is strong. No contingencies. If we lock this in, you'll be free of this house within weeks." I didn't hesitate. "We lock it. Tonight." Silence hummed between us, then her voice softened. "All right, I'll bring the contract by within the hour." When I hung up, I sat there on the porch, my hands folded in my lap. Inside, I could hear my parents' voices rising and falling in the kitchen, their conversation the same as always, complaints about bills, small digs about my supposed freeloading. They had no idea the decision had already been made. They still thought control was in their hands. I almost laughed at the irony. For years, they had repeated that phrase, "Our house, our rules." They had no idea that phrase had died the day they signed those papers in 2019. An hour later, Janelle's car pulled into the driveway. I met her outside before anyone inside could notice. She handed me the folder, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a deal sealed. "All it needs is your signature." I flipped through the pages quickly, recognizing the language I had already memorized from countless late nights of research. Purchase price? $920,000. Closing date? 3 weeks. No inspection, no financing delay. It was clean, efficient, final. I held the pen between my fingers. In the kitchen behind me, I could still hear Diane's laugh, shrill and careless, echoing like it always did after she'd finished mocking me. Earl's lower grumble followed, a rhythm I had grown used to since childhood. They thought tomorrow would look like yesterday, with me sitting quietly at their table while they dictated the rules. I pressed the pen down and signed. My name filled the line with steady strokes, not shaky or hesitant. Each letter was a step away from humiliation and toward dignity. Janelle took the folder, tucking it safely under her arm. "Congratulations, Brooke. You just changed everything." I nodded once. "They won't see it coming." Her smile was sharp. "That's the best kind of truth. the one no one can deny once it's on paper. When she drove away, I lingered on the porch, letting the night air settle around me. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing on my chest. The choice was made. The we and hun contract was binding. Inside, my parents clattered dishes and bickered about groceries, oblivious. They still thought power meant shouting the loudest. They had no idea that, quietly, I had just ended their reign. The midpoint had arrived. There was no turning back. The contract sat sealed in my desk drawer, its ink still fresh, binding, and irreversible. Yet that night, peace was fragile. My phone lit up again and again, Brady's name flashing across the screen like an alarm. At first it rang once, then twice. I silenced it. But the calls kept coming, relentless, his voice spilling through the voicemail speaker before I could stop it. "Brooke, please, I need you. Just $5,000. I'll pay you back this time. I swear." The next message was sharper. "Don't you ignore me. You think you're better than me? You think you can just leave your own brother to drown?" Minutes later, another, broken and slurred. "I can't do this anymore. They're going to take the car. Melissa's crying. The kids don't understand. You're the only one who can fix this." Each voicemail piled on top of the last, a jumble of anger and begging, curses and sobs. I sat at the edge of my bed, listening to the muffled vibrations as the phone rattled against the wood. The sound clawed at old instincts, the reflex to pick up, to soothe, to sacrifice. For years I had been the emergency number they dialed when life collapsed. But I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, my hands gripping the quilt, until my knuckles whitened. I could almost see him in my mind, pacing with the phone pressed tight to his ear, sweat on his brow, desperation leaking into every word. I felt the pull of guilt, the ache that whispers, maybe just this once. Yet beneath it lay a new truth. Once had already happened too many times. Once had become always. Every bailout I had given him had only dug his hole deeper, convincing him there would always be someone to haul him out. The phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail so venomous it stung even without listening in full. "You heartless witch! You wouldn't last a week without me. You'll regret this when you're old and alone." The words tried to wedge into my chest, but I exhaled slowly and let them pass. Threats had lost their bite. I was not the same woman who once believed family obligations meant endless sacrifice. By the 10th call, the screen glowed in the dark room like a siren. Melissa's voice came through now, softer, cracking. "I don't know what to do with him anymore. I'm sorry, Brooke. I really am. I thought maybe you'd understand." Her apology hurt worse than Brady's curses. Because I did understand, I understood how much pain he caused her, how she had tied herself to his chaos and carried the shame silently. But understanding wasn't the same as fixing. I closed my eyes, whispering into the quiet, "I'm sorry, Melissa. But this time I can't save him. I have to save myself." The phone buzzed again, ignored once more. The calls finally slowed near midnight, the silence settling like dust after a storm. My body ached with the effort of holding still, resisting the urge to pick up. But inside something stronger had taken root. Resolve. I reached for the drawer and touched the envelope, the contract inside. My hand lingered there as I breathed out one steady sentence meant only for myself. I won't be used anymore. For the first time in years, I let the phone ring unanswered, and it felt like freedom. The house had fallen into an uneasy silence by late evening. My parents had gone to bed early, slamming doors behind them as if the sound could seal away their anger. The television in the living room hummed faintly before it clicked off, leaving the air thick with the weight of words left unsaid. I retreated to my room, closing the door softly so it wouldn't echo. On my desk sat the photograph of my grandmother June, her smile frozen in sunlight from decades past. She had been the one steady presence in my childhood, the only adult who ever treated me as more than a resource. I picked up the frame, running my thumb along its edge until the glass fogged slightly beneath my breath. "I promised you I'd never let them grind me down," I whispered. I won't let them anymore, not now, not ever again. The words steadied me, but they also cut deep. I thought of the years I had bent under their demands, the countless sacrifices disguised as helping family. They had taken my paychecks, my patience, my silence. And yet here I was, on the eve of reclaiming everything they believed they still owned. Outside, the wind picked up. Branches scraped against the siding, and the shutters rattled like bones knocking together. The weather forecast had mentioned a storm sweeping through the region, but the sound felt larger than just weather. It was a warning, a prelude. The house groaned against the gusts, and I imagined it, shivering at the truth it now carried inside. I set the photograph back on the desk and reached for the envelope holding the signed contract. The paper felt heavier tonight, as if it knew the weight it carried for all of us. I spread it out beneath the lamp's glow and traced the letters of my name. Each stroke of ink was both a shield and a sword. In the hallway, I could hear faint creaks, my father's restless steps, my mother's muffled cough. They had no idea how close their world was to shifting. To them, tomorrow was just another day to repeat the same accusations. To me, it was the day the ground gave way beneath them. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes. For a moment, I let myself imagine the aftermath, my parents realizing too late, Brady raging into voicemail silence, Melissa's quiet resignation, and me walking away with dignity, intact. I had spent so long fearing what it would mean to finally confront them, but tonight the fear was gone. Its place was clarity. The wind howled louder, rattling the window pane until it quivered. A shiver ran through me, but I didn't move. Tomorrow, I murmured, as if the storm could hear me. Tomorrow they'll learn what respect means. The photograph seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, my grandmother's face a reminder of strength passed down through blood, even when that bloodline tried to break me. Her smile carried me through the silence. I folded the papers neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it under the frame. 2 anchors, one from the past, one from the present. Between them, I felt my resolve harden like stone. The wind banged once more against the shutters, sharp and final, like a knock before judgment. I turned off the lamp, lay back on my bed, and whispered into the dark, I won't let them trample me anymore. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was steady. The storm was already at the door. The storm that had rattled the windows through the night finally broke into full daylight fury. By mid-morning, clouds stretched heavy over the neighborhood, and the air carried the metallic taste of rain, waiting to fall. I was in the kitchen when the voices rose, first my mother's sharp cry, then my father's bellow. I stepped into the hallway and saw them standing in the driveway, papers clutched in Diane's hand, her face pale with shock. Earl's fists were shaking, his knuckles white against the page he gripped. The envelope I had left on the dining table had done its job. They knew. Maybe this is some kind of joke, Diane screamed, her voice cracking against the air. Neighbors' curtains shifted, faces peeking from windows. Tell me you didn't sign this. Tell me this isn't real. Earl's voice thundered over hers. You sold the house? You actually sold it? Are you trying to throw us into the street, Brooke? Are you that cold? I walked calmly down the steps, each stride measured, my heart steady. The driveway felt like a stage, the world watching as the illusion shattered. They waved the papers like weapons, but I didn't flinch. My father stepped forward, spittle on his lips. Answer me! You're kicking your own parents out after everything we've done for you? I met his fury with a voice low and clear. Number, I'm not throwing you out. I've given you 60 days to move, and I've already arranged 3 months' rent for an apartment across town. You won't be on the street. You'll be safe, but you won't be here. My mother's scream tore through the air. You're a monster. You stole this from us. You tricked us years ago with your papers and your companies, and now you use them to humiliate us in front of everyone. Her words cracked something inside me, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I let silence fall for a beat. Then I lifted my chin. I didn't steal anything. I saved this house when the county was ready to take it. I paid The taxes. I carried the debt. You signed it all away because you couldn't face the truth. The only trick was your own blindness. The neighbors had gathered now, pretending to sweep driveways, walking dogs slower than usual, ears tilted toward the spectacle. The humiliation my parents feared was no longer a shadow. It was happening. Live and undeniable. Earl jabbed a finger toward me, his voice breaking. Family doesn't do this. Family doesn't sell out their blood. My throat tightened. But I answered without hesitation. Family doesn't treat their daughter like in bank. Family doesn't call her uncaring every time she says no. Family doesn't demand rent in the very house she saved. What you called family was just control. And I'm done living under it. The words struck harder than any shout could. Diane staggered back a step, her grip loosening on the papers. Earl's face turned blotchy red, but he didn't speak. For the first time in years, they had nothing to throw back at me. I drew a long breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to reclaim myself. 60 days, 3 months' rent already covered. That's more grace than you ever showed me. The wind picked up, carrying the words across the street. Mrs. Alvarez froze on her porch, her hand over her mouth. The silence that followed was not peace. It was shock, raw and public. My parents stared at me, their power dissolved into the ink of signed contracts. Their laughter from weeks before, their certainty that they could shame me out, was gone. In its place, tears welled at the edges of Diane's eyes, trembling against her fury. I stood steady in the storm, my voice the final strike of thunder. This isn't cruelty. This is justice, and it's mine to claim. The ink on the contract had already shifted the ground beneath us, but the storm hadn't finished breaking. Late that evening, after the confrontation in the driveway, Brady's truck skidded into the gravel with a screech. The headlights cut across the lawn like searchlights, and before the engine stopped, he was already stumbling toward the porch. Melissa trailed behind him, her face blotched from crying, her hands clenched at her sides. She looked like someone carrying a burden too heavy to name. Brady's voice tore through the air as he stomped up the steps. "What the hell did you do, Brooke? You ruined everything. You're selling the house? Do you have any idea what that means for me, for all of us?" I stood in the doorway, the porch light throwing his face into harsh relief. The stench of alcohol still clung to him, though not as strong as before. His eyes burned with desperation more than rage this time. But the fire was no less dangerous. "You didn't ask me, you didn't ask Mom or Dad. You just did it like some dictator. You knew I was counting on you." I gripped the doorframe, grounding myself before I answered. "Counting on me for what, Brady? Another 5,000? Another rescue? I've been your crutch for years, and all it's done is keep you from learning how to stand." His face twisted, pain cracking through the anger. "Don't say that. I've had bad luck. Jobs falling through, bills piling up. I just needed a little help. And you shut the door in my face. You've always been uncaring. Always holding back, keeping what you've got for yourself." Melissa finally spoke, her voice breaking. "Stop it, Brady. You know that's not true." She turned to me, her eyes brimming with tears. "She's carried you more times than I can count. I begged you to see it, but you never did." Brady's shoulders sagged, but he pressed on, his words ragged. "She's supposed to be family. Family doesn't turn their back when you're drowning." I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. "Family isn't in bank. Family isn't someone you squeeze until they're empty. Family means respect, and you lost that the moment you saw me only as a handout. I can't be your lifeline anymore." The words cut deeper than I intended, but they had to be said. His face crumpled, fury giving way to something heavier, despair. He pressed both hands to his head, as though trying to block out the truth. Melissa reached for him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, Brady, listen, she's right. We can't keep living like this. You can't keep breaking yourself and expecting her to fix it." He sank onto the porch steps, his body folding in on itself. The man who once towered over me with drunken threats now looked like a boy lost in the dark. His chest heaved. and the sound of his sobbing filled the night air, raw and unrestrained. I stood above him, my heart tight. It hurt to watch him collapse. But pity couldn't undo the years of enabling. I forced myself to hold the line, even as the ache threatened to unravel me. "Brady," I said softly, "you need to learn how to rise on your own. Because I won't carry you anymore. I can't." Melissa knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his shaking frame. She whispered into his shoulder, words I couldn't hear, words meant only for him. I turned back toward the door, leaving them there in the porch light's glow. My chest burned with both grief and resolve. Sometimes love meant holding firm, even when it broke your own heart. 2 days after Brady broke on the porch, Janelle asked me to meet at the closing attorney's office. The buyers had confirmed the wire, and all that remained was a final review. I arrived early and sat in a quiet conference room that smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. My parents came in a few minutes later, stiff and guarded. Melissa stayed with Brady outside in the car. No one spoke. Mr. Carlisle, the attorney, opened a thin blue folder. His voice was even. He said there was a supplemental letter tied to the records from 2019. It had been left with the LLC filings when I saved the house. He slid a single page across the table and began to read. "My name is June Hart," he read. "If the Maplewood property is ever sold to protect Brooke's financial safety, I ask that 10% of net proceeds be set aside. The fund will create a scholarship for the first girl in our family who chooses law school. Use it to open doors that were closed to me. Use it to anchor our name to fairness." I felt my breath catch. I had known my grandmother's stories, the way she worked in a factory and read library books at night. I had not known about this letter. Mr. Carlisle continued reading until the last simple line. "Kindness means holding a boundary with a steady hand. If they forget, remind them." Silence settled over the table. My mother stared at the paper as if it were a map of a country she did not believe existed. My father's jaw moved, but no words came. Their outrage, so loud on the driveway, had been replaced by something else. They were looking at the will of a woman whose name had become the spine of this company. They were looking at intent that came before their accusations and survived them. I cleared my throat. "The scholarship will carry her name," I said. "It is already in the allocation. 10%. No less." Mr. Carlisle nodded. "We will structure it today. A simple trust with the scholarship guidelines you approve." My mother whispered, barely audible. "She planned this. She planned it years ago." I answered softly. "She planned for fairness. I am honoring that plan." For the first time, my parents saw the story as more than a sale. This was not a slash and burn. This was a line drawn by a woman they once loved, and by the granddaughter who chose to keep it straight. The room felt different. The air carried weight, but it was clean, not revenge. Order, a seed placed in soil that could finally hold it. Morning light pooled across the conference table like a quiet flag. Mr. Carlisle set out the final packet. Janelle sat to my left, steady and precise. The buyers waited with soft smiles and a cashier's check prepared to trigger the wire. My parents took the chairs across from me. Their faces looked smaller than I remembered, as if the night had thinned their certainty. No one reached for the water glasses. Mr. Carlisle reviewed the pages and tapped where my signature would live. I read every line even though I knew them by heart. Purchase price recorded. Closing date confirmed. Disbursements listed with the scholarship allocation set aside under grandmother June's name. There was nothing left to argue and nothing left to hide. I lifted the pen and signed in clean strokes. The sound of the nib on paper felt like a lock turning. Janelle gathered the pages and gave a single nod to the buyers. The wire released. A small light blinked on Mr. Carlisle's screen, and the house stopped being ours. A message printed and slid into a tray with a gentle thrum. My hands were still. My breath was even. My mother's first words were not harsh. They were wet. "How could you do this to us?" My father pushed back from the table and pressed his palm to his eyes. "You did not have to go this far. You could have waited. You could have forgiven." Both of them cried without restraint. Their grief poured across the polished wood like spilled water. I held the pen a moment longer and then set it down. "I do not need forgiveness," I said. "I need freedom." The room quieted. Even the printer seemed to pause. I met their eyes and kept my voice gentle. "I carried this house when it was collapsing. I carried you when you would not carry yourselves. Today I set it down." Mr. Carlyle slid copies of the trust documents toward me. 10% marked for the scholarship. He asked for my initials beside the clause. I wrote them neatly and returned the page. The buyers thanked us and stood. They shook my hand with gratitude and promised to take care of the maple tree in the front yard. My parents watched them go. The truth did not need more words. It had been written into the record where no one could erase it. I placed Grandmother June's letter back into my folder and rose. When I stepped outside, the wind smelled clean. I walked to the curb and felt the weight lift from my shoulders. Not revenge, release. I chose dignity, accountability, and peace. And I finally believed I deserved them at last. I moved into a small apartment on the top floor of a quiet building that overlooks the park. The windows face maples that catch afternoon light, and kids on bicycles drift up like a promise that life goes on. I unpacked slowly, one box at a time, setting each thing where it would live without apology. The first thing on the table was a kettle. I brewed tea and watched steam curl into the cool air. The second was my grandmother's photograph. I placed her next to the window so she could keep her familiar watch, the same way her stories kept me steady when everything else shook. Boundaries, dignity, and follow through. Her lessons built this landing. I filled a shelf with worn paperbacks and a folder that holds the scholarship trust. 10% is already set aside under her name, waiting for the first girl in our family who chooses law. The paperwork does not feel like triumph. It feels like direction. At night, I walk the path along the park and practice breathing without bracing. No one is shouting from a kitchen doorway. No one is kicking open a door to demand a loan. The silence is not empty here. It is clean. I make dinner for one, rinse a single mug, and let the window stay open to the sound of leaves. I wrote Melissa a note wishing her courage. I did not write Brady. Some letters are only written by action and time. My parents have my new address because I sent the deposit for their apartment as promised. The line is firm. The line is kind. Most mornings, I sit on the sill with tea and watch the park wake. Buses sigh. Dogs tug their leashes. The city hum feels like a lullaby I finally earned. I am not happy. I am free. And from that, I can begin again. Before I say goodbye, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell me in the comments. I read every one with gratitude. And if this chapter touched something true in you, consider subscribing. Not just to hear more stories, but to belong to a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. Remember this much: sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. It waits quietly until you are ready to open your heart. Take good care, and I will meet you in the next story.